Hi there, everybody. Meteorologist Greg D here. Wednesday evening update on Lee. Of course, the hurricane's been spinning out there in the Atlantic the last several days. We've been watching it closely. It's been an interesting setup for the Northeast, but I think the forecast is starting to come together. And I do think there'll be some impact for the east coast of New England, but I think a lot of this is going to be really just at the coast. And of course, the worst of it is going to be up there towards Halifax and actually western Nova Scotia, which is a large wilderness area. So thankfully, maybe a lot of the coast will absorb a lot of the damage, but there's still a population there that'll be impacted as Lee races up towards the north. So let me show you what's going on here. The latest track on Lee, the storm located well down to the south. Well to the east of Florida, 105-mile-an-hour winds right now. So it's a Category 2 hurricane. It's not going to get back to Category 3. And you see the numbers here on the forecast, 105, 190, 85, 80, taking it to basically a minimal hurricane. So the Hurricane Center does keep this a hurricane Saturday afternoon, well to the east of Boston. So this is not going to be a close pass. And I don't think this forecast is going to change much, but just doing a distance here, about 200 miles west of Boston is going to be, or east of Boston is going to be the track from the National Hurricane Center on Lee. That'll probably keep the Boston area probably close to a tropical storm strength wind gust, but not really all that bad. 200 miles on the west side of a weakening tropical system. This is not going to be a full tropical. It's going to be a hybrid system by now. The wind field will be expanding, but when you do that, the winds will be more gusty, less consistent. So I don't think this is going to be a really bad storm for the Northeast, but it will still bring significant impacts. Could still bring that isolated areas of coastal flooding, some down power lines and trees. They've had so much rain in the Northeast the last several weeks that the ground is really saturated. It's not going to take much here to knock over a tree or break some tree branches, knock down power lines, that kind of thing. And of course, the closer you get to the track of Lee, the worse it's going to be, and that's going to be down East Maine. So when you look at the track here, and both the GFS and the Euro are doing this, and basically the Hurricane Center is going right where those two models are going, and that is to cut a path, thread the needle, you could say, right between Nova Scotia and Eastport, Maine. So right there between Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, Bridgetown, and Eastport, Maine is likely where this thing is going to track, right down that channel and then into either New Brunswick or extreme eastern Maine. We'll have to see if there is a landfall, if this is still a hurricane as it comes ashore. So east of Bar Harbor, east of Portland, and most of the larger population centers of Maine, which are down towards Augusta, Portland, Bedford, and down towards the New Hampshire coast. The northern parts of Maine, much more rural. Of course, you've got the mountains up here, a large park area as well. Then until you get up to Caribou, do you actually get any kind of larger population here in the state of Maine. So this is where the track is going to go. Now, there are still going to be impacts, and because of that, the National Hurricane Center has started to issue watches and warnings. So from the border of Connecticut and Rhode Island, so near Westerly, including all of Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, around the Cape, up the east coast of Massachusetts, and through the coast of Maine, up to, looks like Stonington, Maine, there is a tropical storm watch. The yellow area here, that means tropical storm conditions are possible in the next 48 hours. That would be really Friday into Saturday. In the pink, that is a hurricane watch for the coast of Maine. Certainly, they're not strangers to this, but unusual. It doesn't happen as often up here as it does farther to the south, though. They get their share of tropical systems moving through. So that's going to be from Stonington to Eastport, so basically the U.S.-Canadian border. You are looking at a hurricane watch from the National Hurricane Center along the coast of Maine, where hurricane conditions are possible. Now, remember, not everyone in the hurricane watch is going to see hurricane conditions, and even not everyone in a hurricane warning sees hurricane conditions. We saw that when we had Idalia move up the west coast of Florida. Most of our counties were under a hurricane warning, yet no one saw hurricane conditions in the Bay Area as that storm passed well to the north and west. But still, the Hurricane Center is just kind of warning folks ahead of the system that you see the wider view. So Boston is really the largest population center included, and it is included in a tropical storm watch. Eastport is going to be probably the largest. Bangor is going to be the largest population centers that are going to be included in that hurricane watch over toward eastern Maine. And of course, the Canadian authorities are likely issuing hurricane watches for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as they're going to get some surge here on the right side of the track. So Halifax is going to be watching for surge and wind here, as the stronger part of the storm is definitely the eastern side of the storm. That's where you get the really heavy rain. So all of this here, we're going to get this southerly wind coming in, pushing the water into Nova Scotia. For Maine, it's an offshore flow. On the west side of the eye, this is what the wind is going to do. It's going to go south from north to south. But this does also, at least to me, signal the potential for some flooding. And that's because there are some parts of the coast here that do face north. And that's mainly the north coast of Cape Cod. I realize you guys cannot see this, so let me adjust my view here and maybe zoom out just a little bit so we can get Boston in there as well. So that is Cape Cod. That is Boston right there. I'm going to take off the watches and the warnings. You're going to get some high surf here, some strong winds, and the wind is literally going to push the water into the bay here. So Cape Cod could flood on the bay side of the Cape. So it's the north side of the Cape, the east side of the Cape. And then, depending on the wind direction, you could get water pushed into the south parts of Boston. There's another bay here that could be impacted depending on how strong the winds are. So it's going to be your South Boston towns, Hingham, Weymouth, Braintree, the Quincy area. These are the areas that could see this north to south breeze, wind pushing the water down into the bay. So that's something that they'll probably be watching for. I don't know if you call that a surge, but it would definitely be a water rise, depending on the tide. I'm not sure what the tide is here. It would be above where the tide should be for sure. Too early to issue any kind of surge. Well, actually, there you go. They do have surge information already. So in the blue, 1 to 3 feet. And here's what I was talking about. It's the first time I'm seeing it. So my hunch was correct. 2 to 4 feet inside of the bay, inside the Cape. So Sagamore Beach, probably south of Plymouth, over towards the Brewster area, maybe even Provincetown, you're looking at water getting pushed down into that bay, filling up that bay like Tampa Bay would be filled with a southwest wind, and that could cause flooding. They are not a stranger to this. Remember, this area gets strong nor'easters here, which in many cases have lower pressures and stronger winds than what Lee will have as it's moving through this area, but still, this is definitely a concern, as you don't typically see this in the summertime months. What are the chances of seeing tropical storm force winds in this area? Cape Cod has the highest chance of seeing tropical winds in Massachusetts. They're in that yellow, so 30 to 40%. So still not all that high. You really have to go up to Maine to see parts of Maine be in that brown color. 50 to 60% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds in eastern Maine. So Eastport down to Bangor, Maine, probably going to see the highest wind gusts from this storm. In terms of hurricane conditions, chances are very low that anyone in Maine, or even for that matter, Nova Scotia, will see hurricane force winds sustained. Now, I do think there's going to be gusts. I think Halifax west to the eye of the storm, to the center of the storm, may not be a real eye by then. Could definitely see wind gusts of 70 to 80 miles an hour if this thing really gets cranking. It'll be a hybrid storm. It'll be a mix between a nor'easter and a hurricane. And these things can produce some really strong gusty winds. It's not unusual to see hurricane force wind gusts on Nantucket with some of these strong blizzards that blow up in January or February. So that would not be a surprise. When does all this arrive? Let's do the most likely arrival time for tropical storm conditions. And we'll assume that Boston would get into tropical storm conditions. So by Saturday morning at 8 a.m., everyone along this black line may experience tropical storm conditions. So you're looking at Boston before 8 a.m. Saturday, likely getting into tropical storm force gust. Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the rest of down East Maine, likely by 8 p.m. on Saturday. So conditions are going to go downhill during the day on Saturday in eastern New England. That includes Portsmouth, New Hampshire, too. They're probably looking at an arrival time between 8 a.m. and noon for the tropical storm wind gusts. Now, that's the gust. I really am interested to see how many folks here actually see sustained tropical storm force winds. I would think the only people that are going to see tropical storm force winds in New England are going to be on the coast. Literally within a mile or two of the beach, you may get some sustained tropical storm force winds. Everyone west of there and inland, likely going to see the winds gust. And there's some higher elevation here just off the coast, so that could also enhance the wind. That's also possible. But overall, I think a lot of the strongest winds, I think most of them are going to be in that 40 to 60 mile per hour wind gust range, are going to be right at the coast. Remember, this coast is very different than Florida. It is not sandy. It is rocky. The elevation increases very quickly as you head out from the beach through the land and you head inland. So not as susceptible to large surges. The ocean here is deeper offshore, but still 2 to 4 feet of maximum surge. That's going to cause some flooding along the coast. Anyone that's right at the beach, especially the Cape Cod, they've got more beaches than anywhere else here, more sand out there, and that may be a little bit easier to flood than places farther up the coast, especially once you get to Cape Ann and north. A lot of the places there's not a beach. They're set on a bluff of some rocks, at least 10, 15 feet off of the surface of the ocean, and that gives you that buffer. But there will be big waves crashing into that. There's going to be some dramatic video. I expect lots of reporters out in Chatham, Massachusetts, probably. That's going to be the eastern end of the Cape. Growing up here in New England, there's always somebody out here right in Chatham, right on the water, watching the waves crash. This is where they get some of their strongest winds and some of the nastiest weather. It's the closest position to the eye, probably, as it passes to the east of Massachusetts. So you're probably going to get some folks out there. Other than that, the storm will move through very quickly, and actually will get out of there probably by Saturday night. You're going to see things improving very quickly across the New England coast. So that's the latest here. I think this is going to be a nor'easter type system. I think there will be impacts, obviously heavy rain, gusty winds, coastal flooding, minor for most, except around Cape Cod where it could be a little bit more, isolated power outages, that kind of thing. Hard to predict where those are going to happen, especially with the saturation of the soil here. Very likely that there will be trees that'll just fall over in 40-mile-an-hour wind gusts, far away from the center of the storm, just because the ground is so saturated. So that is also a possibility. The worst impacts will be in Nova Scotia, Halifax, west towards Yarmouth in the western half of Nova Scotia, where they could get into some hurricane force wind gusts and maybe a stronger surge there. And some huge waves too. Lee will be out of here. There's another storm behind it. That'll likely be Nigel. That one likely not going to impact the United States too. So it looks like at least for the next couple of weeks, although the tropics will be busy, I don't see anything impacting the state of Florida. If you've got friends and family here in the Northeast, they're just going to have a nasty New England type weekend that you'd maybe expect more in the late fall or early winter instead of in the summer. But I think most folks here will be okay. There'll just be a more of an inconvenience for more than others. Those along the coast will probably have to make some preps to prepare for Lee. I've got another update tomorrow morning. That's in my Instagram reels. You can check it out there. I record those between 4:30 and 5 a.m. So when you wake up, check me out on Instagram at Greg D. Weather for your latest forecast details. Take care, everybody.